So before 2017, a large number of iPhones which were assembled in China came with the inscription "Designed in California, assembled in China." It stopped after 2017 and it's up to speculation why that happened. But the fact is that Apple's fortunes are inextricably linked to China's. So initially, Apple moved manufacturing of iPhones to China for cost savings, outsourcing like so many other companies had done. But they went in very, very deep. Apple was doing things in terms of engineering at a very bespoke level, unlike some of the other phone manufacturers that were using off-the-shelf kind of parts and they had standard fitments and things like that. Apple was doing some very interesting engineering on their phones, which is why the iPhones were so good, and that required deep engineering expertise. So they went into China because that's where they got scale. They got hundreds of thousands of workers that were available to put these phones together. But they also eventually transferred the technology of making these phones to the Chinese vendors. And Chinese vendors and suppliers, by the way, Taiwanese vendor Foxconn also operated out of mainland China because that's where they could achieve that kind of scale. The government used to collaborate with the businesses and make sure that a lot of the rural workers were able to come to the cities and work on these manufacturing plants. And initially, nobody was really interested in kind of exploring other options because the geopolitics seemed to be heading in the right direction, because people believed that accepting capitalism would bring China into the mainstream, and they also became part of the WTO. So everything was heading in the right direction. So Apple went in and trained a whole bunch of vendors. They sent in all the engineers, some of the best engineers that would go in and explain how things had to be done. They even invested up to $14 billion of their own equipment on the vendors' assembly lines, which is not very typical. So this was Apple's way of ensuring that they got quality, and the way they could make sure of that was to train the vendors. So the technology transferred. So much so that local vendors actually started to make their own brands. And then companies like Vivo and Oppo sprang up, and they are some of the biggest manufacturers of smartphones across the globe. And Chinese vendors were unique that they operated on razor thin margins because of the scale, but also because they were willing to work on those margins to pick up the expertise, to learn how to manufacture. And it wasn't just assembly, it was an entire ecosystem of manufacturing, including multiple vendors that supplied all the parts. And it's very difficult to replicate that entire ecosystem in another country. And that's the same reason that Apple is now trapped, and it's going to find it very, very difficult, if not impossible, to get out of China and run a profitable business. Now, these are not my thoughts or my research. This is all written in this book, Apple in China, by Patrick McGee. It's a really interesting book, very well put together. It's very journalistic. The only thing is it feels a little bit old now, because in bits and parts we've got all this information. This is a very convenient place to read it all at one go, but it's not something that's earth-shattering and kind of completely changes your perspective.